some things. If somebody's got something real quick, let's address that and then we'll go.
See you at night, buddy.
All right. Sunday, we went through, the timing of Revelation 2 and 3.
Are you talking about Sunday school or?
We did it at both.
Church, and then we repeated it in Sunday school, but we did it in church. And I kind of wanted to put that in perspective of larger prophecy and bring us up to the current day and where we're at in prophecy. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So I want us to start with the beginning of timed prophecy. And where is the beginning of timed prophecy, where we have a timetable established in prophecy?
You mean in Genesis?
Isaiah.
Genesis 3:15, prophecy of the Savior coming.
No time frame in that. Daniel chapter 9. And Daniel 9.
Did you say prophecy of the end or just prophecy?
Prophecy of a timetable
Of
of
a
what is happening.
Okay.
What is the future? There's a lot of prophecies about the future. I will do this, and this, but there's no timetable given
Got it.
for it.
Right.
But Daniel gives us a timetable. And I want to combine that and look at Revelation and kind of try to fit stuff together so that it all fits in. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So we start in Daniel 9:24-27. Daniel 9:24-27 is the again is the centerpiece of messianic timetable in the entire Old Testament, and all New Testament prophecy hinges out of Daniel 9. So Daniel 9 gives us some time frame. What is the time frame that Daniel 9 gives us, and where is it found?
77s. And 24. Your people.
77s doesn't help
The
us.
70
The 7
weeks.
weeks.
That doesn't help us without something else.
Without the starting point.
Without the starting point, you need to have a starting point. Without a starting point, I can say it's going to take 483 years. But if I don't know what the starting point is,
So you mean from when Cyrus issued the decree?
so verse 25 gives us a starting point. And what is the starting point?
Peace treaty.
The issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem.
Rebuild Jerusalem.
The starting point for this prophecy is verse 25.
62 sevens.
No,
From the
rebuilding-
issuing of the decree to rebuild what?
Temple.
The streets of.
Don't,
Coming up.
I love,
Don't guess.
yeah, I love, Ron Tucker used to say when he'd ask questions out of the Bible, he'd say, it's not written on my forehead, it's in front of you.
Is it when
He said,
is it the rebuilding of the wall?
The wall, yeah.
what's it say? It says right there in black and white.
No, therefore, go ahead.
To rebuild streets and a trench, but in times of.
To rebuild what?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. Now that's important. Because you said the temple,
Decree to rebuild Jerusalem.
but it is not the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple. It is the decree to rebuild Jerusalem.
Yeah, because it was all burned down.
But are you talking, are we talking about, back in time now, like Zerubbabel's temple, or we're talking in the future,
No, we're talking the
the
past.
past? Okay. And Zerubbabel, I mean, Israel was captured, I mean, and then they go to build Zerubbabel's temple. Didn't they build a temple first, then Jerusalem, or no?
They did. In 537 BC, 537 BC, Cyrus gave the order to return to Jerusalem and rebuild
Temple.
the temple. But notice Daniel does not say rebuild the temple. If it was, you would have to start at 537 BC, and that would mean 50 years before Christ showed up, the 70 weeks would be over. Right?
Right.
So, but it doesn't say rebuild the temple. It says rebuild Jerusalem. So we cannot start with Ezra and Zerubbabel going back. They did not rebuild Jerusalem. They rebuilt the temple. But Jerusalem was still an unbuilt up city. It was just a temple in the middle of isolated houses. So it is not until 457 that the initial decree is issued for Jerusalem to be rebuilt. Now, where is it recorded about the rebuilding of the temple? Where is it about the rebuilding of the temple? Where is that recorded?
Did you just say it, Ezra? Or no?
In the book of Ezra. But that is not the rebuilding of Jerusalem. To follow the rebuilding of Jerusalem, where do you have to look?
Nehemiah.
Nehemiah. So it is not until Nehemiah. Now, Cyrus does not give the order to rebuild Jerusalem. It is Artaxerxes, his grandson, that gives the order to rebuild Jerusalem. And it's 80 years later.
Artaxerxes was whose
Cyrus.
Cyrus's grandson?
Well, that's the city. That's the rebuilding of the city. Once you have the wall, you have a city. Without a wall, you don't have a city.
Isn't it kind of funny though? I mean, because back in those times, the walls around the city protected it. Wouldn't you, putting the cart before the horse on this one? You know, why would you build a temple and then people come in and invade it?
Well, for two reasons. First of all,
You have to have a place to.
because that's what they asked for.
Mhm.
Ezra went and asked for the right to rebuild the temple.
I see.
Why would Cyrus be willing to rebuild the temple but not the city?
Because
Wants
people
them.
would stay in captivity as opposed to going back.
Perhaps, but there's a more direct
Increasing
reason.
its threat. To rebuild the city.
Yeah.
If you rebuild the
God.
city, what does that give the people?
Defense,
Military.
a stronghold. Yeah.
And what does that give the people? Yeah, independence.
Thought that's what Louise just said.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lots of people were saying things,
Okay.
sorry. My ears aren't as young as they once were. They would have had independence. And with that, the power to perhaps rebel, to do any other kinds of actions against, as long as they're just hanging out there, they're dependent upon the king to provide for them. And they don't have the ability to provide for themselves.
So was allowing them to rebuild the temple only just something to appease them or give them something to do, or what was the reason?
Well,
Or maybe it was just a blessing of God to turn the king's heart that way.
God very often uses natural means to bring about miraculous ends. The standard procedure for the Babylonian Empire, remember who conquered Jerusalem and destroyed it? The Babylonians. Their standard procedure was to take people into exile and take them out of the nation. And therefore, you won't rebel because it's not even your homeland.
Mhm.
Persia, when Persia takes over under Cyrus, Persia had a different philosophy for governance. Do you remember when we went into Afghanistan so disastrously and Iran so disastrously? What was the attempt by the United States when we went into these countries?
Nation building.
And how do you go about doing that? They said the same thing in Vietnam. If you go back to Vietnam,
Putting someone in power.
what was the means that they said we would use?
Like
This phrase was bandied about in the military and talking about the military
to police the nation?
Advisory.
to win the hearts and
The-
minds.
Democracy,
It was to win the hearts and minds. We'll go in and we'll build schools and we'll build roads and we'll build infrastructure and we'll dig wells. And why are we going to do all of this?
So we get our way.
To win the hearts and minds.
That sounds like what the Romans did.
Well, certainly the Persians did. The Persians' idea was, we want to win the hearts and minds of all these people that had been conquered by Babylon. So we'll say, you can all go back to your homeland, and they will be so appreciative that they will
Support us.
Yeah, still have allegiance. to it.
have allegiance. But they were not naive and stupid about it. They didn't say you can go back and fortify yourself against us. They just said you can go back.
Mhm.
But as some of the people went back, and remember, this is for 80 years. They've been building the temple now for 80 years. They've been in this situation. Think about how long 80 years is.
2 generations.
Yeah.
80 years ago is World War II. Think about how far we are removed from World War II. When the people proved to be loyal for those 80 years, they began to say, you're out there in the middle of nowhere, us having a fortress there, if you're loyal to us and you've proved loyalty for 80 years, it's not a bad thing for you because if you can protect yourself, you can be a fortress to protect us. And so slowly over time, it morphed into more and more giving that independence as different people proved loyal. And to that point, the Jewish people had proved very loyal under Zerubbabel, and there'd been no talk of rebellion. They'd been very happy to have their temple back. They had been, they paid their taxes, they'd done their things, and of course, what brings that about is who's in the court. Daniel's long gone by this.
That's the other shit.
Daniel's been dead a long time by this. But who do you have? Nehemiah, not Ezra. He was a priest. What was Nehemiah? He was not a prophet.
Wasn't he in the king's service?
He was,
The
Called-
cupbearer.
he was the
I was cupbearer to the king.
Pretty good.
He was, now, what position was the cupbearer?
Right next to Pharaoh.
Yeah, like the
Right next to
right-hand
the
man, I
guy.
guess.
He
Keep him
was the
alive.
person who the king trusted enough to supervise the food he ate.
So I get poisoned.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And that was a very prestigious, that's a person that's by your side all the time. You eat with them, you talk with them, they're sitting right beside you at meals. They are, and so very quickly, monarchs who are isolated from a lot of people form a relationship with their cupbearers. So he has this personal relationship. So when Nehemiah says, these are my home people, and they're suffering out there in the wild, they're being attacked from without, can I go and fortify the city to protect them? Well, the king has so much trust in Nehemiah that he is his cupbearer. If I can't trust my cupbearer, who can I trust? So he sends Nehemiah to be the governor. And says, hey, if I've got, Nehemiah there, they're not gonna do anything against me.
Just a quick question. He sends his cupbearer to be a governor.
So now he needs a new cupbearer. Yeah.
Jack, that's where you come in.
We probably should have one for you several years back.
Somebody tried to poison him?
Well, no, but when there was a big riff,
Hmm.
Yeah.
it could have been a handy thing.
So that begins this timetable. Not when Cyrus says, go rebuild the temple, 537. But when Artaxerxes says to Nehemiah, go back and build the city, 457. So then you have time going forward. What's the first time that is talked about? What's the first time that's talked about? There is a time there.
After this period of 62 sets of seven.
Ah, you missed something.
Seven weeks.
Seven
There
sets
will
of seven.
be 7 sevens. What's 7 sevens? 49. So there will be 49 years. And what will happen in the 49 years? What will happen in the 49 years?
Walls rebuilt.
Yes, the city of Jerusalem will be rebuilt in, it specifies what?
The despite perilous time.
Yes, perilous times, the NIV says times of trouble. King James is probably troublous times, something like that. There will be 49 years of struggle to rebuild the city and to keep it safe. Did that happen?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, read the book of Nehemiah. It talks about the violence that was being done, the attacks that were being carried out, all of the things that were going to happen. Now, bear in mind, when Daniel's writing that, that's 100 years before this happens. It's going to be another 100 years from when Daniel writes until Artaxerxes gives that command to go back and rebuild so Daniel isn't just fudging it by writing this in after it happened and make it look like he's right. His life is ended 100 years before Nehemiah takes off to rebuild Jerusalem. Then after that 49 years, what will there be?
The 62 sevens.
62 sevens.
Mine said the opposite, it says 77s. 70
You on
Seven.
verse 26?
are to grieve for the people. And then it says,
But we're in verses 25.
then it says, there'll be 7 sevens.
There's the 7 and then 62 sevens. Yeah? We there now, Nick?
Yeah.
All right. So what is the end of this total? So if you total up 7 and 62, what do you get?
69.
69. What's 69 times 7?
483.
483. So in 483 years, what does that bring us to?
When the Messiah is cut off.
What's it say after 62 sevens? What? Well, I'm sorry, it does. What does that bring us to though first? Before he can be cut off, what has to happen?
To rebuild Jerusalem.
Till
Palm
Sunday.
Sunday.
Messiah comes, the anointed one
Will be,
Palm
comes.
Sunday.
and be cut off. So
We'll get to that, but
It's a week
the
later.
Messiah has to come. Now, what's that say about Judaism today? Because what is Judaism waiting for?
The Messiah.
The Messiah. But the Messiah can't come now for the first time because he had to come 483 years after 457 BC.
Guess they don't take that literally, huh?
Yeah.
Do you ever talk about that with your friends?
They,
Um,
the Jews that I deal with, Reform, they don't even believe the Messiah is a person.
right.
Oh.
They believe it's a time of enlightenment.
Yeah.
So, and that's a reform,
Oh,
not
yeah.
reformed, reform. So they believe anything,
Yeah.
essentially.
They are the second most secular of modern Judaism.
Do you ever talk about
Where
that
do
with
they-
your friends though, to see how they interpret this?
I have not.
I mean, they are so well versed in the things, that they're well versed in, that it might be an interesting
My
conversation.
friends that spoke here.
Yeah,
That's why I was wondering who you were talking.
yeah, well, I forget their name now.
Yeah.
Rosenbluths.
That's right. Yeah.
Be a good question.
Yeah, I would think it would be,
Yep.
just saying, in light of your scriptures and your interpretation.
So that brings us to Christ. Now, what is going to happen to the Messiah?
Cut
It's
off.
gonna be cut off.
He's going to be cut off. So the Messiah needs to be killed. Now, after the Messiah is killed. That, what does that end? What does that end?
You're not talking about,
Right here, what does that end?
Or the city.
I'm looking for it on your face. I don't see it.
You didn't learn your lesson yet.
City sanctuary.
No, what does the Messiah coming and being cut off end?
Destroy the city.
No, that doesn't happen until 70 years later, though, right? Or
What
40
does
years.
that end? It's simple, you're overlooking it.
The war.
The 69
69 week.
sevens. From the 60, the 7 and 62. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be cut off. So the death of Jesus, the death of Messiah, the cutting off of Messiah ends the 62. And 7 is 69 sevens.
Right.
So that's over now,
It ends the 69th week.
right?
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
Now it says there are some other things. Now bear in mind, who are all of these prophecies about?
Israel.
Israel. So every one of these prophecies, it's not about America, it's not about Christians, it's not about the world. It is specifically about Israel.
So the church age is not in here.
Verse 24. Are decreed for your people and your holy city. Every single part of this prophecy is about the Jewish people. They are central to this prophecy. Now, it gives two hallmarks that will happen after the cutting off of Messiah. What are the two things that will happen after the cutting off of Messiah?
Destroy the city and the sanctuary.
The city of Jerusalem and the temple that will be rebuilt will be destroyed.
That comes in 70 AD, right?
And that's 70 AD.
So about 40 years later, almost, right?
Correct. But it doesn't say how much later,
Yeah.
because we are outside of the 70 weeks now. And then there's a second thing. What's the second thing?
Then will come in like a flood. The war will continue until the end, and the desolations have been decreed.
So what's the second thing that is?
Second thing that has to happen before the 70th week is what you're saying?
That's going to happen during this time after Messiah is cut off?
War.
War? What kind of war?
The abomination that causes desolation.
No. What war?
Not
Are you
Armageddon.
talking in the past?
I'm talking past, present, and probably future.
Mm.
What war?
Armageddon.
Nope. Who is this about?
The Jews.
Israel.
What war?
Well, they're in all kind of wars.
The war, the ongoing war against the Jews. There will be a war, will continue. After the city's destroyed, will that be the end of the war against the Jews?
No.
No, that war against the Jews that leads to the destruction of Jerusalem will continue.
It's happening right now.
And what will that bring about? It says there's a second thing with that war.
And the desolations.
and desolations.
Be
So there will be an ongoing war against the Jews that will lead to desolations against the Jews, such as
Holocaust.
the Holocaust, the Spanish Inquisition, the pogroms in Russia, the exile from nation after nation after nation, the attacks on at Columbia University here in the United States,
That's all part of it, all the,
wars and desolations against the Jews. Wouldn't you say that all qualifies? But now we've got to zoom out, and this is what I wanted to do in bringing this, because why is it that this isn't time? The 69 sevens ended, and the 70th seven hasn't begun yet. This is all going to happen between these two things.
church age.
And that's because there is a gap between them. When God is not working directly through the Jewish people, he is working through the
Gentiles.
church.
The church.
Is that shown at all, or that's a complete mystery?
Well, it's a mystery, but the fact that there's this gap, because the time for your people ends. 77s are decreed for, that's all Israel has left in God's timetable. 77s, 490 years, right?
I guess my question is, do we see that separation? Do you see that separation here?
Absolutely, because the 69 ends
Okay,
at Messiah, and then it doesn't pick up until after the sanctuary is destroyed and there are wars and desolations. And none of that is in any of the 77s. So there's an untimed period that is not part of God's of Israel, when Israel is not the focus of God. Your people only have, and you can say that, 490 years left. Israel, you have 70 years. The 70 times 7 years. 490 years in my timetable. Period. At the end of those 77s, my timetable with you is going to be over.
He does say your house has left you desolate.
Yep. And yet there's this time in between that 70, between 69 and 70, when the temple's destroyed, when there's wars, when there's desolations. So by extension, looking back, we can say it's obvious that there is something going on here other than those 77s, or God's timetable would have been done 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the time of the church. And that's where we come into, now, before we do the time of the church, we've got to go ahead to the next event for Israel. What is the next event for Israel? Let's jump over this church age, because we've said from their perspective, what's going to be happening for Israel during the church age? The temple
Wars.
destroyed, wars, desolations.
And Antichrist.
I'm sorry?
The Antichrist.
Not yet.
So what is the next event for Israel?
Peace
Signing of the
treaty.
peace treaty.
He will sign a covenant, the peace treaty with the many nations, and will rebuild the temple. And that will start that 7-year tribulation
The
period.
peace treaty, the signing of that starts the,
That's
Seven.
what starts it. People say, well, the rapture starts it. It does
Mhm.
not.
but the rapture is before it, and it could be a months, even years or
A,
something.
a month, a year, who knows, some period of time.
Okay.
But the rapture does not coincide with the signing of the peace treaty, or doesn't have to. Those are two separate things, and what restarts that? So when we go to Revelation, because remember, Revelation is merely an extension of this Daniel 9:24-27 prophecy. That's all Revelation is.
Can I ask you a question? And this is
Sure.
not, I don't want to say it's off on a rabbit trail, but would the Antichrist signs that, so would you say he's already in power before the rapture, or do we
He
in somewhat kind of power?
in some kind of remember, he is the prince of the people who will come. So he is already, when he signs the covenant, a prince. He is a ruler of some level.
Yeah, that's kind of what I figured. I mean, he was probably on the scene already,
No,
and then this gives him
Doesn't have
more,
any authority.
this would give him more
Catholic Church.
dominance by maybe having a idea of what happened what happened with all the people gone, right? Or
well, you have to go in a little further into that. And you have to go into Ezekiel. Because a lot of times in Christian circles, they talk about the Battle of Armageddon, but there are a number of end times battles that are talked about. And one of those that doesn't get talked about modernly, but's in the scripture, is the Battle of Ezekiel. And in Ezekiel, it talks about the invasion of Israel by a coalition of nations that is very similar to the Battle of Armageddon, but it's not the same thing. And that happens at the beginning of the tribulation period, or probably immediately prior to the tribulation period.
and are they repelled by Israel? Kind of.
I think they're repelled by some supernatural means. And Antichrist is going to be satanically inspired enough to take credit for that. I'm the one that stopped this war. And that's going to be what rises his currency so that he can force people to sign this peace treaty. You single-handedly stopped this war. Whoa. Now, whether he really did that or not is an entirely different question. But Satan has no problem taking credit for what God does.
Well, I know on the, in the Rapture movies, one of the big things when all the people, they say when all the people disappear is I've removed all the haters.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mm. And that sounded so foreign back then, Paul, all those, you know?
That was 26 years ago. That was 1990, almost 27 years, 1998, the first of those came out. And they predicted that term haters, and boy, we've seen that flourish.
Was that
Tonight that the US is taking over Gaza.
really?
US will be taking
Oh.
over Gaza.
Well, yeah, he met with Netanyahu and they were
What's
talking,
happening
you
with
know, about,
Palestinians.
yeah. Was that article or that letter I gave you, was that from Neria on Sunday?
Yes,
And he said that, you know, as Messianic Jews, they are looking beyond the war part of it now to the spiritual side of it,
yeah.
from the physical war to the spiritual side of the end times. I thought that was real interesting. You know,
So when you go to Revelation, and I want to put Revelation in the context of Daniel 9:24-27. because the next thing is, he will confirm a covenant with the many for one. Where do you see this in the book of Revelation? This person that goes forward and enforces this peace treaty.
Revelation 6, maybe?
Revelation 6, specifically verses 1 and 2. And what, of course, is the first, what is about 10 verses of Revelation 6? What is that?
The seals.
It is the seals, but specifically the first about 10 verses is what? It has a special name. The subgroup of the seals.
Oh, inactive.
But it is a group. It's a subgroup of the seals. Well, what happens in those first verses?
The Lamb opened one of the seals.
But what happens?
Judgment? No.
4 living creatures with a voice like thunder.
The people cause them.
No.
Mm.
Read on the page, what happens?
I am. Everything I'm reading is on my.
No, this is written on your page. Tell
Well,
me what
some of it,
actually
not
happened.
all of it. Some of it was like Louise was just.
Yeah.
Just read the
that's-
first verse.
The
Two
lamb
verses.
breaks the seal.
And what happens?
And I heard one of the 4 living creatures say, in a voice like thunder, come. I looked, and there before me was a white horse. It's
So you have a white horse. And then you have a
rider.
Red horse,
red horse. And then you have a
black
The
horse.
4 horsemen.
black horse. And then you have a cream colored
The
horse.
4
Or
horsemen.
gray horse. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Which are a subset of the seal judgments. They're the first 4 of the seal judgments are the 4 horsemen, right?
Right.
What is the 4th seal, the 4th horseman? We're gonna take them in inverse order.
4th, yeah.
Is death. And how widespread is that death?
1/3.
No.
What's the
Fourth?
first seal? So it's not.
1/4.
1/4 of the world's population. In other words, in today's population,
25%.
2 billion plus people. What's the 3rd horseman? The black horse.
Famine.
Famine. The destruction or the inability to deliver food. What's the 2nd horse?
Disease?
War.
War. So now you know why, now you know why there is the famine. Why is there famine?
Because of war.
Because of war.
Because of the war.
It's a result of it.
And also.
Have you ever seen what happened in Europe after World War II?
Famine.
Oh, you know, the number of people that died from after World War II was not quite as many as during it, but almost.
Nobody was planning anything during the war.
Yeah.
Freaking.
And all the resources were going to the war.
Yeah, and the homes were destroyed and the machinery was destroyed and everything was destroyed. And it took years to come back from that. So that brings us to the 1st horse. What is the 1st horse?
Yeah.
White horse.
White horse.
The white horse, who is,
Right.
how do we know he's Antichrist?
He uses the bow.
Yeah.
He
Yes,
looks
that-
like Christ. In fact, I had professors in in seminary tried to tell me that that was Christ. And I laughed in their faces and said they were ignorant, crazy people to think that.
Which endeared you to them, I'm sure.
It will on Judgment Day when they
Well.
don't listen.
Yeah, when they'll be without excuse.
Um,
Not the second coming.
Hmm.
so he looks like Christ, but what's significant about the bow?
The bow is Satan's weapon, while the sword is Jesus's.
The bow is Satan's weapon, Ephesians 6, while Jesus' weapon is
The sword.
the sword. And so if you compare that rider in Revelation 6:1 with the rider who is honestly Jesus in Revelation 19, you see the disparity between them. So that is the revelation of Antichrist. So that means that everything before chapter 6 in Revelation falls into this category of this gap between the 69th and 70th week. When did the 69th week end?
Cut off.
When with
Messiah.
Messiah.
Cut off.
When does the 70th week begin?
Peace treaty.
The peace treaty with Antichrist.
Right.
So if the Antichrist appears in Revelation 6:1, everything before that falls into that gap between Messiah cut off and Antichrist appearing, correct?
Yeah.
Right.
So you're saying there's actually, the end of the church age is the rapture of the church. So there's even a little bit of time between that and the start of the 7-year period, correct?
Of
Like-
an undetermined amount of.
Probably not a lot.
Could it be days? Could it be hours? Could it be weeks? Could it be months? It probably isn't decades.
Right.
But could it be a year? Maybe. The point is, we don't know how long that gap is, but it is there.
You know what? You could understand that wouldn't be immediate because it gives Satan that time to sink in. You know what I mean? All the trouble, and people would be, the first day of all the trouble, they're afraid. After a couple of weeks of it, they're really scared. Do you know what I mean? So it
Yeah.
actually brings it to a crescendo.
And in the middle of that, Ezekiel 38, you have this invasion, maybe spurred on by the disappearance of these people, of the forces of Gog and Magog doing their initial invasion into Israel, that then is halted by some supernatural means, and probably that's how the Antichrist gets his authority.
Gog and Magog is Russia.
Is yes,
From the north, right.
people north of Israel.
If you think about it, what Israel is the most hated of all the nations, and what holds people back from attacking them now is Christianity. You know what I mean? The Christian nations. Well, all of a sudden, if there's no Christians, who's the opposition? Who's saying no, we shouldn't? Right now we are saying, President Trump is saying, we defend Israel as our friend. Well, all of a
Right.
sudden, if everybody's gone who defend, or most of the people, guess what? Why not attack them?
Oh,
It's
absolutely.
open season.
Well, it came close when Biden was president. They were gonna go after him.
Huh.
But Israel fought back.
So
Mm.
that means that if you want to look to, from outside of Israel's perspective, what is going on during that gap, you go back to Revelation 2 and 3 to the church age. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so as we went through Sunday, both in church and in this Sunday school class, this progressive thing of these 7 church epochs during the church age, the time of Ephesus, which is, when's the time of Ephesus?
That was at
Before
the end of the
Philadelphia.
apostolic
The
teaching.
end of the first century, the end of the apostles, the age of the apostles, 100 AD. When's the time of Smyrna?
I don't have it written here.
100 to 300s.
100 to the 300s. When is Pergamus?
300s to
390.
400s.
The end of the, sometime in the 300s through,
900.
400s.
no,
900?
the 900s. That
Yeah,
four
that
must
makes
be a
more
nine.
sense, yeah. Because next is the 1,000, so
When is Thyatira?
1,000 to
1,000
1,500.
to 1,500.
1000 to 1500. Sardis,
15 to 1,700.
15 to the 1700s. Philadelphia,
1,700 to the 1950s.
1700s to the 1950s. And then finally the age of Laodicea. So that plugs in exactly between the 69th week and the 70th week of Daniel. And it comes right before Revelation 6, where Antichrist is revealed, that starts that countdown again and is in that gap. So my goal tonight, and we've gone a little over, was to show how all of that plugs in together to give you a time frame for measuring all of God's plan up until the return of Christ in glory. 69 weeks, starting in 457. Add into that the gap of the church age. Restart the time of Israel with the 70th seven, the last 7 years of the tribulation period, and that brings you to the return of Christ in glory. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that fit everything together into a cohesive?
This is recorded, right, Paul?
Yep.
This one? Okay.
We record all the Bible stuff.
Yeah, I thought you did, but just to make sure. I gotta go over that one more time.
Only once.
Yeah, for me.
So, any
More than once for
questions?
me.
Any questions? Does that? People sometimes say, oh, that end time stuff is really deep. It's not deep. It's complicated. And there's a difference between those two things. Deep is so profound that you can't understand it by human reasoning. You can understand this stuff.
This is all perfectly logical, is what
It
you're
is
saying.
perfectly logical.
Yeah. Mhm.
It's just complicated, and you've got to get down the concepts and fill in some dates and some times. And that's what I was hoping to do tonight by adding together Daniel and the church age from Revelation 2 and 3.
The black horse wasn't death.
No,
The pale horse was death.
right.
That's what he said.
The black horse was
Famine.
famine.
Yeah.
The red horse was
War.
war.
You got your mind on that Eagles game there.
And why, and
The green
and again,
horse was-
why did they go in the order? I deliberately took them backwards to work back
To
to
see how
Antichrist.
how it
But the-
caused.
The appearance of Antichrist, even though he forms a peace treaty, what does that bring?
War,
War.
war brings famine.
War brings famine,
Famine brings death.
and famine brings death. You see how they're dominoes just falling one after
Yeah,
another.
Very logical.
Hey, okay.
Yep.
Thank you. And that's why the death wouldn't be a middle horse, because death is the end of that process.
Yeah.
Mhm.
God bless. Have a great.
Good night.
See you all.
Good night.
Thanks, all.
Good night.
Good night.
What are you gonna do now? You have your gloves on already?